Do you have an interest in the legacies that historical and not so historical figures leave behind? Are you curious about how to ensure family heirlooms and life lessons are passed on from generation to generation? Are you interested in developing your end of life plan to alleviate family discord and encourage generational wealth? Well, I invite you to listen to Heirloom and Legacy, a podcast that explores ancestry, heirlooms, legacy, mortality, and more. I am Angelyn C. Frazer-Giles, your host, and I look forward to sharing these discussions with you. Let me tell you a story. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1966. My maternal grandparents were born in Honduras, but after losing several children, my grandmother Mary traveled to New Orleans, Louisiana, to increase her chances of bringing a child to full term. On September 13th, 1926, Mary gave birth to a healthy baby girl, my mom, Celestine. My mother spent the majority of her formative years in Honduras and later moved to New York. From the time I was about 4 or 5, we visited Honduras every summer. So while my friends in New York went to visit relatives down south for the summer, we really went down south to Central America. In July 1975, on vacation in Honduras, my beautiful, loving 48-year-old mother suddenly suffered a heart attack and died. I was 9 years old, and my life was forever altered by her death. My mom's death was devastating for my entire family. She was our rock, our strength, and the guiding light that held our family together. At the time of her death, 2 of my sisters, my niece, nephew, several cousins, and I were in Honduras. One of my sisters, my stepfather, and many other family members journeyed from New York to Honduras for the funeral. In retrospect, we think she knew of her imminent death and wanted to be in La Ceiba to see her father one last time and to be buried with her mother. My mother's death was my first encounter with a home funeral. Her casket laid in my aunt's living room above 2 cauldrons of ice. As you can imagine, modern refrigeration of bodies was minimal in a developing nation in 1975. My family and friends held a wake and repast in my aunt's home. There was no formal funeral home. Side note, in the book Passed On, African American Mourning Stories, a Memorial by Carla F.C. Holloway, she discusses the advent of embalming and the funeral parlor. Embalming was widely used after the Civil War as a way of preserving soldiers' bodies that had to travel miles to where their families lived. Prior to funeral homes, families would hold rituals for their dead in the parlors of their home, hence the name funeral parlors. So the desire by a family to keep a body in a home for days after a death and preserving with ice or cold air is not a foreign concept. At the time of her death, I was too young to know anything about wills or estate planning, and my sisters knew very little about what my mom's end of life wishes were. My mother unfortunately died intestate, meaning without a will, and essentially without a plan on how she wanted to be interred and how she wanted her assets distributed. In addition, neither she nor my stepfather had a plan in place about what would happen to me in the event one of them died. After we returned from Honduras, my distraught stepfather and sisters distributed her assets in the best manner they could. The house that was only in her name was sold at a fraction of its worth, and the proceeds of the sale were distributed to me and my sisters. Again, what would happen to me? I was a minor. There was no plan. But my sisters stepped in and decided that they would be the ones to raise me. My biological father and adopted father were both born in Honduras, migrated to the United States, and died within 2 years of each other. I was in my 20s. As far as I know, my stepfather died intestate, and as such, I received some bedroom furniture he purchased for my room in Arizona, where he relocated to after my mother's death. Now, the most diplomatic way I can describe what happened after my stepfather's death is this. A family member ensured she received the money from his pension and bank accounts. My biological father had 6 children, including me. He lived with his wife, their daughter, my eldest sister, in a house in what was previously known as Do or Die Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York. He died intestate also over 30 years ago. In 2019, my eldest sister died. Her death set off a chain of events that we are still sorting through today. My other siblings and I had no idea that at the time of our father's death 30 years ago, that only his name appeared on the deed of the house he shared with his wife and eldest daughter. Essentially, at the time of his death, since he died intestate, and since his name was the only name on the deed of the house, his wife and his 6 biological children became the beneficiaries of his estate that included the house. Subsequent to that revelation, we lost one of my brothers 2 months after my eldest sister died, and my father's wife died in 2021, leaving her 2 sons, who were not my father's children, as beneficiaries of her estate. Trust me, if you are absolutely confused and fascinated by this story, there are millions more out there that are even more complicated and devastating. I completely understand and won't bore you with further details of how the legal nuances in rectifying my father's estate, or in this circumstance, his house, are challenging and vast. Needless to say, becoming an end-of-life planner is personal for me. My experiences have been the catalyst in my desire to help people avoid the trappings of financial and personal discord associated with a loved one's death. My goal for Heirloom and Legacy podcast is to encourage dialogue that alleviates the fear and uncomfortable nature of discussing an end-of-life plan. I will bring you more stories of lessons learned, legacies, heirlooms, ancestry, and mortality. I hope you join me each week in this journey. Thanks for listening.